the next speaker is going to be talking about the Florida Landscape Conservation Project, Florida Ecological Report Card. Great, Nicole Burns and Anthony Gillis. So please, the next slide. The purpose of this is to inform about the Florida Ecological Card for Marine and Estuarine, as well as the Terrestrial and Freshwater Habitat that provides a broad habitat-based framework to then evaluate current conditions and desired future conditions of a set of conservation assets. This relates to the water quality improvement and fish and wildlife and habitat protection priority items, action items. With any further, yes, let's move on to the presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you guys so much for having us. Both Nicole and I will be discussing this project and just give you guys really just a little bit of a background on the project, the development that's gone into the project, the report card, and what exactly you may find in the report card. So my name is Anthony Gillis. I'm bioscientist with Florida Fish and Wildlife, and I've mainly focused on the marine side of this project. So a lot of the water quality and fish diversity extent of our marine and estuarine conservation assets, and Nicole has focused on the terrestrial side as well as kind of just the general development of the report card. She really put a lot of work into the design of that. Next slide, please. So the Florida Landscape Conservation Project was initially started as a landscape conservation cooperative with US Fish and Wildlife. And of course, that mission was to foster landscape scale conservation to sustain natural and cultural resources for future generations. And with that, what we wanted to do is assess the status and trends of those assets, of those landscapes, of those just natural and cultural resources, and look at any emerging threats that may affect them. And then, of course, with that, understanding those trends, setting some goals, measurable goals, and trying to hit targets to help essentially move a conservation needle to protect them. Next slide, please. So through the initial development of this project, we worked with a few different stakeholders and especially USGS to develop what we call our conservation assets, which are those resources that are of the most priority to the landscape of Florida. And these are our conservation assets. You'll notice we have most of our terrestrial and freshwater on the left and marine on the right, but we also have connectivity and working lands that we're hoping to add on to the second version of this indicators report card project, which I'll talk about more towards the end. Next slide, please. So indicators are obviously the measurable expression of our conservation asset and its condition. So they can be biological, chemical, physical, or even cultural assets or metrics of that landscape. And each one consists of three different qualities. One that, of course, it's measurable. We can go out and look at it. It has a set and widely used metric, as well as a target. This is really specific to our terrestrial and freshwater indicators, and I'll go into more of why we don't have that for a marine environment. So we needed them to actually absolutely meet those three qualities in selecting our indicators. Next slide, please. So to select those indicators, we went about it through a pretty big process. So again, brainstorming workshops, more brainstorming workshops started in 2016. We did more in 2017, and what we did is we had attendees come and identify established indicators that were already in use. So an example of that would be like in our saltwater marsh asset, we have extent that has already been used by the Coastal Habitat Integrated Mapping and Monitoring Project. So we really wanted to take those indicators already in use and bring them to the forefront, but also provide this broader look at the landscape and not just focus on regional areas, though we do provide that information. But getting back to our indicators, we do have, once we had them selected, which you'll see in the picture there on the right, we had attendees essentially put dots next to the indicators they felt were going to represent that asset the best, and then we ranked them. And then following that, we wanted them to be representative of that conservation asset and respond to both environmental variation and, of course, the actions that would be put towards protecting them. Next slide, please. So what happens after we had those selected, we did have to go through a secondary indicator evaluation process and apply another set of criteria to really refine that list. One is just the spatial data that was available. It needed to be statewide and collected historically and relatively, consistently. We didn't want to have to be comparing metrics that maybe were somewhat comparable but weren't the same. We really needed them to be the same across the state. And then monitoring methods, we really wanted the same protocol being carried out by those monitoring methods, as well as confirmed future monitoring, because we are projecting this future and hoping to carry this future on into this project on in the future. And then we had follow-up webinars to really present not our final findings, but our findings on the data evaluation. And that just required us to get more expert and partner input of what we found and how we were going to use the data. Next slide, please. So again, we talked about targets a little bit earlier, and that was a goal of this project, was to set targets so that we could essentially have something to shoot for with these indicators and with their trends. So one of the first things we did is, of course, look for targets that were already established for Florida. That required a pretty deep dive into literature review, asking the experts. So again, it's again having those workshops. Again, we did this in 2019 for expert and stakeholder input on those reasonable targets. And the important thing is we did want reasonable targets that were achievable by 2030. Those are the goals we had set out for the project in trying to get these the needle moving on these things. Next slide, please. So these next two slides will go into the indicators that are selected. So the first you'll see here is our terrestrial and freshwater indicators, and I'll leave it here for a second and let everybody get a good look at what they are for each asset. And then if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. And then this is it for the marine and estuarine assets that we have. So again, I'll leave it here with let you guys take a look, and glean any information from this, or as much information from it as possible. All right, awesome. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Nicole, and she's going to talk about report card development, what all went into that, and then go into our terrestrial and freshwater specific indicators in the report card.
Awesome. Great start, Anthony. Thank you so much. And again, I'll just say thank you again for having us all here today. So yeah, I'll just get into kind of a brief overview of the actual design and the purpose of this report card of both the terrestrial, freshwater, and marine estuarine report cards. They differ just a little bit. And so the first thing to really keep in mind when we were designing these report cards was what was our goal, like our end purpose. And we wanted something that was going to be easily digestible by a wide range of audiences. So we wanted to be able to have that really awesome, great data and analyses, but also be able to have, anyone be able to look at this and read this and easily glean the conditions and the statuses of our natural resources. So something that's clear, concise explanation of these conditions. So next slide, please. And so the first step to do this was to look at several other different report cards. And so this was something that was, the idea of a report card is not a new idea. Several different agencies and entities have started using these types of documents to discuss and to do exactly what we were setting out to do, which is, again, to display the conditions of their natural resources. So we wanted to look at several other examples and see how they laid out their formats and what they did to display their data. Next slide, please. And so the first thing that we noticed when we were looking through all of these examples was this idea of a color gradient depicting a status. And so this is something that was, in our opinion, was very elementary. It was very easy to understand, where green means good and red means bad. And so it would be something that, again, kind of going with our overall purpose of this, of design, is that it'd be something that would be easily understood by that wide range of audiences. So next slide, please. And with that in mind, we took this idea of a color gradient and we attached that to our gradient scale bar scoring system. And so this is exclusive to, Anthony kind of mentioned that there's a couple different differences between our terrestrial and freshwater analyses and report card and our marine estuarine analyses and report card. And so exclusive to the terrestrial freshwater, we created this gradient scale bar scoring system. And so this is where the far red is 0% of our desired conditions being met for each indicator. And then on the far green side, 100% of our desired conditions being met. And so through our indicator selection process and our data collection process, we did our data assessments and we established the current status. And then when we set our sort of end all be all ultimate 100% condition being met number, and we plotted that, our current status and what our target was based on our workshops, and we plotted those on our score bars in this example that you will see here. And then we also are including an update line, and so this is if there is any applicable updates, as we are releasing updates to the report card or new versions, then that blue line is that update relative to where the current status was when we started out and relative to where our target is. Next slide, please. And so also rolling with this color gradient theme, another thing that we saw common and that we really liked was this idea of a condition mark and trend, which pretty self-explanatory. We took, again, green meaning good and red meaning bad. And then we wanted to look at the trending data, like how it changes throughout the years, and include a trend arrow, whether it's doing better, doing worse, staying about the same, or if it's a trend that we don't necessarily know. Next slide, please. Or advance. And so we included this idea of this condition mark and this trend arrow, and we plotted that next to each of our indicators with that score bar. So that way, it's something that's just very clear cut, very easy and simple for our viewers to glean the information from our report cards. So hopefully the idea was that anyone can flip through this report card, and if they're not one to sort of dive into the numbers, they can look and see, okay, the condition for this indicator is green and it's trending upwards. So, we must be doing something right in this area. Next slide, please. And so we took all this information, and you'll see this in the Terrestrial Freshwater Report Card, and Anthony will go through a little bit more of the Marine Estuarine Report Card. But so you'll see all this information right up front for our score bars and our condition marks and our trends labeled there in the beginning of the report card. Next slide, please. And then for each conservation asset, you will see the pages for each conservation asset has all their indicators laid out in a similar manner, such as this, where for each indicator you have the associated score bars and the associated condition mark and trends. And if you'll advance, those are circled there just as a couple examples. And then once we summarized all those informations for each indicator to create this overall status for each conservation asset. And so again, and those have our condition mark and trends. So again, something hopefully where anyone can flip through this and page through this and easily and quickly glean that information for these natural resources. Next slide, please. And so also for each asset, we included a brief description of the different land cover types that you'll find in those assets there for each asset page. Next slide. And also for each asset page, you will see there's an associated map which plots out the range of each of these assets, and we break it down by the different public and private lands and how we've prioritized different areas for conservation. And then also for each indicator, we have an associated data table. So that way for everyone who does want to dig into some more of those numbers and be able to see that and associate that with each of the indicator score bars, they can do so. So each of those indicator data tables are there as well. Next, please. And also for some of our indicators that we only use once throughout the report card, we included a brief description in terms of like where we got the data, how we analyzed it, and how we sort of used all of that. And that's included with the respective indicators on each of those pages. Next, please. And then also there are a few indicators that you'll see here that are used for several different conservation assets throughout the report cards. And so those are listed up front in the beginning of the report card, and we did something similar where with these descriptions of these indicators, we included the data source, how we analyze that data, and how we set those targets, and how we're just sort of all around using that information. Next, please. All right, and I'll go ahead and let Anthony take over since he did all of the data analysis for the Marine Estuarine. So he's going to go into a little bit more about the differences for the different report card.
Thanks, Nicole. So as Nicole mentioned, there are some differences between our terrestrial and freshwater, and then our marine and estuarine side of the project. One of the big things, though, is we did want to keep with the traffic like idea. Again, that good, fair, poor. Good means good, red means poor. The only difference, though, is ours are focused in the marine environment on the trend, and that's a percent change per year, not necessarily the percent of the target being met, or a percent of the target being met. So ours are just based solely on what's going on in the trends in those assets and those indicators. I'll go ahead and address it now. The reason we didn't set targets, one, it was just through some expert elicitation that they just said the marine environment is just really hard to set targets for because it is such an open system. That being said, in our marine and estuarine side of the project, you'll notice we have some more terrestrial assets, and that's our saltwater marsh and mangrove swamp. So in the future, we're not excluding targets completely, but for this first version, we really wanted to just set a baseline of what's going on and then assess targets in our versions to come. And another thing I'll point out is data collection for this was finished in 2018. And so we will come back and of course get to probably go from 2018 on to as far as we can for the next versions. Next slide, please. So throughout the report, again, similar to our terrestrial and freshwater side, we use that color gradient throughout our tables, figures, and graphs. So you see that here. One of the things I will point out is we do, and it may not have been apparent with Nicole's presentation, but we do provide some regional breakdowns, particularly in our marine data. So you'll notice here, D is, of course, Charlotte Harbor. And where you guys are focused, but you'll notice again it provides that trend and that traffic light configuration of how things are going. Next slide, please. And similar to our terrestrial and freshwater, we do provide a description of our more generally used conservation asset indicators. So you'll notice for extent, we have these icons that that show mangrove swamp, saltwater marsh, seagrass, on down to fish diversity, which is used across all 5 of our marine and estuarine assets. And so what we do in this description is just provide an idea of where the data came from, why it's important, and how it's being applied to our conservation assets. Next slide, please. And then where we don't have, or we have a more specific to that conservation asset indicator, so something like living tissue area for coral and tarred bottom, we do provide a brief description of what the metric is, and a little bit about why it's important to that conservation asset. And in this case, like living tissue area is a good metric of a general area versus something like percent cover. So where that's applicable, we do try to provide a little more detail on that indicator. Next slide, please. So as I said, marine and terrestrial and marine report cards are very different. Marine is a little bit lighter than the terrestrial. But that being said, as we move forward, we will continue to track and monitor all of our indicators. We'll be collecting more data when it's available. Look at the progress they're making, and updating the status based on progress. Our conservation action are these actions that we want to be carried out moving any sort of needle? Are we getting to the direction we want to go? Next slide, please. So that being said, one of the things is producing a report card 2.0. So the next version of this project will be focused on that report card. As I mentioned earlier, we'll discuss, we'll be adding in at least 2 more indicators, but we'll also consider many more, because when we had our initial stakeholder meetings, we had a lot of indicators proposed, and it was either because data wasn't available or it didn't meet those criteria, but we hold on to them so that we can potentially consider them whether data becomes more available, or the metric, a metric gets applied statewide, addresses those criteria. We'll also look at new data sources to help build out. So again, kind of that idea of looking for maybe potentially more spatial data or more temporal data to help get at that indicator assessment. And then, of course, finalizing target development. And we hope to have this version out sometime next summer. That's the goal. But as with what we learned over the past year, some things can be delayed very easily. Next slide, please. So here's some information on where you can find not only our report card, but as I mentioned, we do have spatial data, and I know you guys are focused on one specific region. So if you go to our conservation planning atlas, you can actually have access to the spatial data, and you can focus on the areas that are of concern to you. That was one of the big things about this project is, yes, we want to provide that big landscape wide of here's what's going on, but we also want to allow it to kind of cascade down to a more regional effect so that local stakeholders and managers can have a better understanding of what's going on in their local region. So you can find our report card and indicators data there in tabular, PDF, as well as spatial data form. So you guys are able to get your hands on that data there. Next slide. These last 2 slides are just a few of the contributors' data that helped us really get this project underway and to the point where it's at now. So we are very thankful for those people. And with that, I'm not sure we have time for questions, but I and Nicole will probably stick around a little bit to answer any that may go into the chat. We didn't put our emails, but I can put them in the chat real quick. And if you guys have any questions for us, please feel free to reach out to us and ask us any questions.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Anthony. Great job. My goodness, that was a phenomenal work, and I know because we did several years ago, the NEP did a same kind of a report card. That is hard. It is really hard. It was done, and you guys. So, without any, yes, please ask questions if you have any. We have a few minutes to maybe to cover because we have a few minutes. Anybody? There's a question here.
I know that you had said that there was regional data available online, and I was wondering, and as part of the 2.0, I certainly understand the idea of doing it by asset statewide, but I also think it could be valuable to consider maybe doing like 6 regional fact sheets focused on Panhandle, Northwest, Southwest, Northeast, Southeast, and Central Florida, and aggregating those asset grades into those different regional assessments and kind of looking at, I mean, that would maybe even potentially change some of the grades if they were looked at a regional scale versus a statewide scale. Have you all considered doing that as part of this 2.0 exercise?
Yeah, I think that is something we'll certainly consider moving forward. I think it's hard for me to answer the terrestrial environment because that was, it's kind of, the analysis was taken a different direction with the Marine and Estuarine, and when you guys get a hand of get a copy of the report card, you'll notice that we do break it down by region, and it's not. And I see what you're saying of like, oh yeah, we want these 6 regions and looking at them, and kind of this rolling up essentially. That would be a goal for the future versions of the report card. I think one of the hardest things though is that even with the marine environment, the data is it's kind of sparse. So rather than just saying, oh, well, we're going to nix all of these, we wanted to present what we have and where it's at now. So we certainly will consider it for the future. But where we can, especially in the Marine and Estuarine, we do provide those regional breakdowns so you can have some idea of what's going on in those specific regions. And you can see that in the report card. I think in the table I presented, it does break it down by, especially with fisheries independent monitoring, we had the 7 major estuaries and what the trends were in those major estuaries.
And just as a quick aside there, so in our technical report for the terrestrial and freshwater side of things, in the technical report, our indicators are displayed and broken up spatially as well. So you can get an idea of how that is broken up like regionally and spatially. And more specifically, I don't know that we've necessarily discussed breaking those up into different regions, because you're right, that could really change. And if we assess things at a regional scale in that way, that could really change the scoring and give like different and grading. So that would be something really interesting to look at. And it's not something that we are necessarily opposed to. For the first iteration and the design of this, it was just to take it at a statewide scale. But I think that's definitely something to consider for the future.
Thank you.
That's an echo there. Any other questions? All right. Hey, one more thing. I want to really advise you. I just opened the link to the website where and I'm looking at the maps. Oh my God, they're gorgeous. It's a very easy, interactive. Kudos to you guys. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you so
our
much.
Website there is, sorry, I don't remember if Anthony mentioned it, but on our our conservation planning atlas, like you said, we have a lot of our other data available there, and there's a lot of other tools that this project, landscape conservation project as a whole, has created or has helped in the development of. And so one example is our conservation access tracker, our climate adaptation explorer, and our fire map viewer, which is a tool that we use actually to develop some of our indicators, the fire regime indicators. And that looks at the burn data across the state of Florida for the last few decades. So so there's a lot of really great tools there, a lot of great information that's been developed through this whole project. So please feel free to to look around there. And I see Anthony put our emails there into the chat, so definitely feel free to reply to any of us personally with any questions on anything there.
Great, thank you.